Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 43 of The Clutch Dump.
20 years of trying, 20 years.
And Senna sprints away. Banana.
Straight. Rossi's right in behind Lorenzo.
The 101st Indianapolis 500 is won by Takuma Sato. Dale Earnhardt will come to the caution flag to win the Daytona 500.
Guys, we are talking about the WEC, or the WEC, 1,000 miles of Sebring, which turned into the 8 hours of Sebring. We are talking about FP1 and FP2 of Formula One. Ben's gonna talk about the Newcastle 500, the multiple races we had there, and then we are going to preview what is coming up tomorrow, the 12 hours of Sebring for IMSA. And last but not least, we got some tidbits of automotive news. But before we dive into all that, make sure to follow us on Instagram at The Clutch Dump, and make sure to follow, subscribe, wherever you're listening on any platform. And then obviously if you're on YouTube, make sure to subscribe as well, like the video, and turn on that notification bell. Ben and I are both wearing hats of teams that did not do well today. So welcome to the Losers Corner. Come on in, take a seat.
What are you talking about?
Take a seat. We are kind of commiserating. Not really. Ben is happy with how Ferrari did.
Yeah, we did
I
well.
wouldn't be, because but I guess when you're used to losing, third place, I guess, whatever. But over here at Porsche,
yes,
we're expecting to win all the time. Ben, first of all, how was your Friday? And secondly, what would you like to talk about first?
My Friday was all right. Thankfully, I got to listen to the 1,000 miles of Sebring, which wasn't 1,000 miles.
Nope.
But I was listening to it because I was at work today, so I had it on in the background as I was angrily working on a Mustang. So, Nick, Patty, how was your day sitting at home watching the WEC?
I mean, it was pretty good. I already showed Ben this, but my brother and I spontaneously went out and got our Lego 963s.
Nothing makes a grown man happier than some Legos.
Yeah, I don't know why I thought this would help them do better.
Nope.
Just smashes the thing in half. But, so no, it was good. The race was, the race, like the first 3 hours was like the best parts of the race. You could go without watching the last 5 hours, because there wasn't too much that happened in the last 5 hours. And I guess because I've just said what I said, we should probably start with the 1,000 miles, no?
Yeah, I mean, we should start there. It is the, it quite literally ended 10 minutes ago.
Yeah,
so this is
fresh.
This is about as fresh as a race review gets. So the very exciting start of the hypercar era for the WEC. It's the first time we got to see several cars on track in race conditions. Those would be the Ferrari 499P, the Van Wall, and that was it. All the other ones have been on track before. The Glickenhaus has been on track. We saw the Porsche and the Cadillac at Daytona, and then the Toyota, obviously, we have seen before, although all of them have been revised for this year, some more than others. We're looking at
it has, because the commentators were saying, as you probably heard, the Toyotas were running like 3 seconds a lap faster for their fastest laps this year at Sebring than they were last year. So whatever Toyota did, holy crap.
Figured some stuff out. So I'm going to start with qualifying, and then we can get into the nitty-gritty of the race. And qualifying is where the Ferrari fan, the Tifosi, finally won something this year. We finally had a high note, and we did have the number 50 Ferrari AF Corsa 499P on pole position, driven by one Antonio Fuoco. We were very excited. We were very happy. There was hope. We being the Ferrari fans of the world.
They don't exist. It's just you.
There's actually a lot of us. We just cry alone. So the number 50 was on pole, followed by the 2 Toyotas, the number 8 of Brandon Hartley, and then the number 7. And then kind of after that, it was about as expected. There was the number 51 Ferrari, the 1 Cadillac that is racing in the 1,000 miles of Sebring, followed by both Penske Porsches, and then the Peugeots, the Glickenhaus, and the Van Wall. Now, the cars that we did not have high hopes for, had no expectations for, was the Van Wall, the Glickenhaus, and the Peugeots. Peugeot did not run a full season last year. They ran select races. The Glickenhaus is the Glickenhaus, and Vanwall is a new car. So we do not have high hopes for those. But however, the Glickenhaus and the Vanwall were over 4 seconds in qualifying behind the number 50 Ferrari, which 4 seconds over 1 lap is insane. So hopefully they can get those sorted. Those are the only 2 non-hybrid hypercars running in WEC this year. That's probably what it has to do with. It's also they're working with the smallest budget because they are privateer teams. So I mean, like, I think we all want the Vanwall to do relatively well, and as Americans, there's a small part of us that wants to see the Glickenhaus do well.
Not really. I really don't like whatever the CEO's name is. I think he's extremely arrogant.
Jim?
Yeah, Jim. Jim, you're arrogant. I don't like you.
I don't care about people in motorsport. So the car looks cool, and you can buy a street car version that has 3 seats. So cool. The Vanwall, everyone was pretty excited about because it's a name that most people aren't familiar with. Nick, you know more about the history of Vanwall than I do.
One of my first car models was actually a 1950s Vanwall Formula One car, a little 143 scale. So for those of y'all that aren't too familiar with Vanwall, they were basically irrelevant by the early 60s, but they ran Formula One cars in the 50s at the birth of Formula One. The most notable driver was Sir Sterling Moss, who was a driver of Vanwall in the 50s. They ran a lot of, it wasn't Formula 2 and it wasn't Formula 5000, but it was the second tier series below Formula 1 in the 50s as well. It was one of those English manufacturers like Elva or like Coventry Climax, a bunch of the 50s, 60s like bespoke English manufacturers.
There used to be
a ton.
Like, most people don't know this. At one point, there were hundreds of auto manufacturers.
Well, it was like Cooper and all that.
Right. There were hundreds of auto manufacturers that existed for like 10 years.
Yeah.
And there were a bunch of teams that only built race cars because you don't really care about people when you build a race car. You just need to win races. And it was the 50s and 60s. Well, safety wasn't a thing.
What's the... it's like BRM has been... The name and the rights to it has been bought out. Now it's a watch brand.
Right.
But it's one of those... another one of those brands. Another one is Brabham being started in the late 50s. But obviously Brabham has had more recent history with Jack Brabham, David Brabham being drivers. And now we have the new Brabham BT62 or whatever. And
the cool thing about the Vanwall is that, the cool thing about hypercar in general is that the cars all look very different, which is cool.
The Vanwall looks
The Vanwall looks super good, and like the cool thing is, like, if you look at the 963, the Porsche, like, you can see, like, it's clearly a Porsche with the 4 headlights. If you look at the Ferrari, it's got some cues in there. Same thing with the Peugeot and the Toyota.
And the Cadillac, I think, has the most.
The Cadillac looks very Cadillac. But the Glickenhaus and the Vanwall is kind of like, we're just going to make it look like whatever we want because we're not associated with anything else. And I think the Vanwall could have quite easily gone more down the route of the ARX 06. The Accurate and been a very aero-looking car, and this is a much sleeker looking car. So I think the Vanwall looks awesome. Moving on to LMP2, we had the number 23 United Autosports car driven by one Oliver Jarvis, followed by the number 28 Hertz Jota car of Pietro Fittipaldi, and the number 31 Team WRT by Robin Freins. Nick, do you follow LMP2 in any way, shape, fashion, or form?
I haven't in years past. I was paying attention to it a lot more than I normally do in this race.
Right.
But I'm also very familiar with the teams because obviously the teams do a lot of other things. You have WRT that's run European GT3. You have, Jota that's been running this stuff forever. So, yeah.
Right. So something to note about the LMP2 teams is that later this year, you'll hear some of those names talking in hypercar. So Hertz Team Jota, that number 28 car driven by Pietro Fittipaldi, they are so they're running in LMP2, but April 29th is the date I heard, is they are taking delivery of their 963.
Yeah, so they'll be running an LMP2 car and a hypercar. So
no, they're going to be running just a hypercar.
the commentators in Sebring said they're going to be running an LMP2 car and a hypercar.
Okay, the commentators I was listening to said just a hypercar. So,
What broadcast were you on?
Motor Trend.
That's what I was on.
Really? Okay.
I wonder who heard it correctly. One of us is right.
Anyway, Hertz Team Jota will have a 963. I don't know
What we do know is that team runs a 963 at Le Mans. Whatever else.
Regardless, there'll be a very pretty gold 963 at Le Mans. And then for next year, for 2024, there's 4 or 5 current LMP2 teams that will be running a hypercar program.
I think WRT was another one that's stepping up.
WRT is another one, and United Autosport has been rumored but not confirmed.
United should run a Cadillac because it's an American team.
I absolutely agree. So that is the cool thing about hypercar, is that it is so much more approachable than LMP1 was.
Yeah.
Like, it's like a tenth of the cost to run a hypercar for a season than an LMP1 car. So that's why there's so many cars. So supposedly so there were 11 hypercars on the grid.
It's supposed to over double for next year.
It's supposed to be closer to 23 cars at the start of next year,
dude,
which is going to be
so
cool.
Because
and
then a podium will be exponentially more rewarding, because it's not like you were the best of 3 or 4 teams. It's like you were the best of 6 teams, 7 teams. Actually, if there's 23 cars, assuming that each team runs 2 or 3 cars, you're looking at between 8 and 10 teams. That's
right.
Yeah.
You know, in some of these teams are only going to run one car. Like, you know, there was only one Cadillac. You know, Hertz Jota is only going to run one car. So, I mean, it's one of those things of quite quickly. The top class in sports car racing is going to become bigger than a Formula One grid, which is going to be super cool to see.
It's going to be so cool.
Because I mean, very rarely do you see the top class
being the one with the most competition,
having so much competition, so many cars on the grid. So that's gonna be super cool to look out for. And then in GTE, we are gonna call it just GTE for the sake of this, because there's only GTE AM in WEC this year. For qualifying, we had one Sarah Bovey in the number 85 Iron Dames Porsche RSR in P1, followed by one Ben Keating in the number 33 Corvette C8R. Followed by Ahmad Al-Harti in the number 25 ORT Aston Martin Vantage. Nick, so you watched the whole race. I watched the whole race. And so a thing to note is that the 1,000 miles of Sebring is not always 1,000 miles. Actually, from what I've looked at, it's never been...
I was going to say, other than back in the 70s, and
it's never been 1,000 miles in the history of modern sports car racing.
I want to say WEC's been around since 2012, so at least since 2012 it hasn't been 1,000 miles.
Right. Even the LMP1 cars weren't doing it. They were at 985 miles. They were all 4 laps away.
Which I think it's stupid that they have a time condition. It should just be the 1,000 miles, and the part of what makes it unique is that it could be 10 hours, it could be 8 hours, it could be 14 hours.
Yeah, that is one of those things that I forgot that they had that time limit on it, so I was listening to it, and then all of a sudden they were like, yeah, we've got 2.5 hours left, and I was like, no, how many laps do we have?
That's tomorrow.
Tomorrow is the timed race. So it did become an 8-hour race. Because the race just ended, we don't have the stats and everything, and I don't remember how many laps they completed because it went down to a timed race. But since I'm going to upload this tonight, I'll try to get some stats and put them up on the screen if you're on YouTube.
Be simple editing, and we can pop this son of a gun up there.
I'm going to put this one up tonight. But I'm actually interested to see how many laps they completed versus an LMP1 car, and also the lap times difference between especially the Toyotas, because we have a direct comparison of a Toyota hypercar and a Toyota LMP1 car.
I'll be curious as well what these times were compared to the DPI cars, the IMSA ran the 12-hour just last year, 2 years ago.
Right.
Because those cars were obviously very light, a lot less aero, but the power that they made was tremendous. So
right. Can we talk about Sebring as a thing for a second?
So I, in years past, have hated Sebring as a track. For some reason, this race, I was sitting there and I was like, I really enjoy the actual on-track action of Sebring.
Sebring makes for great racing because Sebring itself, as a physical racetrack,
Is miserable.
Is pretty shite. I
was sitting there, and you know how Goodwood has the heritage, so does Silverstone, of being one of those tracks that defined racing in a country?
Right.
Because normally like I said in years past, it was always one of those things where it was like, Sebring's a garbage track. When are they just going to kick it off the calendar? It's all flat. There's no like whatever. And I was sitting there, and this race I was like, no. Like, for some reason, especially with the final little chicane, the camera angle they had, you could see the planes in the background. I was like, Sebring is like, if you actually think about it, more integral into the story of U.S. racing than Daytona is, because it's been this track, mostly this layout, but the identical surface for 80 years.
Since 1950. So the track opened in 1950, and it has never been resurfaced.
Yeah. There's something so special about that.
There are portions of that concrete,
that were taken off by World War II aircraft when we were going to kick some Europeans' asses.
That was, laid down in 1950. And it's one of those things of, we saw in free practice.
There's parts of that track that were paved when Porsche wouldn't have been allowed in the country because they were Nazis. Like, there are parts of the Sebring track that was built when Porsche was building Panzer tanks.
Right.
Porsche's vehicles that they made when Sebring was built were Panzer tanks for the Nazis.
Right. So, so Sebring is it's one of those things of, I was thinking about it while I was laying underneath a car and listening to the race, was that, Sebring is a pretty terrible track because of, it's got surface changes, it's got no elevation, whatever, but it makes for interesting racing.
Very.
Because it's got surface changes,
no
and
paved
it's
runoff.
So dirty. There's
school.
No paved runoff. It's all grass and dirt, which, as we saw, has consequences.
Caught a lot of people out, yeah.
But, it's one of those things of, the track is dirty all the time. It's not, it's
just
not
an
maintained.
old school track, and
it is
so
an old
rare.
racetrack that people don't race on anymore. And it's one of those things of, it's I'm sure the drivers complain all the time that the track hasn't been resurfaced, but if they resurface Sebring, it'd honestly be probably pretty boring racing.
I was going to say, it becomes a boring track with no character rather than a boring track with character.
It is a flat racetrack that's, how many turns is it? 17?
Yeah,
16? Yeah, 17. It's not that... the interesting part was that it's when was the last time you saw a car flip on lap 7 of a race?
Yeah.
And it's one of those things, the top class of cars. Almost one of every make spun at some point, went into a tire barrier. And the other thing is, you've got a track with surface change, it's always dirty because there's no paved runoff. So when people drop a wheel, it shoots dirt onto the track.
As it should be. And then also, WEC has banned tire warmers and tire blankets for this year. So you've got cars there's 55 cars on a grid, so there's traffic everywhere. They're on cold tires. The track is dirty. So it creates such interesting racing. But, if you just looked at Sebring, Sebring, pretty terrible track. If you went there in your little Lotus track toy and did
if you went there by
on a hot
yourself,
lap weekend, you would be like, this
is horrible.
Was
this
a
is
waste
miserable.
of money. I hate this. But
This
then
is
when you're sitting there in 78-degree Florida weather and you're watching Ferraris and Porsches battle, you're like, wow, I love
this
Sebring.
is awesome.
Yeah.
So, so I think we should go through the race. And the first bit of action we saw, of real surprising action, was the number 2 AF Corsa GTE Ferrari, that in turn 1 on lap 7 or 8 was running wide, hit some dirt on the track, spun, and went into the tire barrier.
Well, yeah, unfortunately, when you look at the onboard, so you had the Iron Dames GT3 RSR and the Corvette battling, which was fantastic. It was such good,
awesome GT racing.
At no point could you tell that someone was or wasn't going to make a dive bomb move. And the Ferrari goes into turn 1 behind these two. And he was, I think, a second and a half back. And he had been closing in those opening laps as the Porsche and the Corvette were battling. And it honestly looks like he went in hot. So he brakes, and you can hear with the throttle application, he starts applying throttle way earlier in the corner than you normally do. And it's one of those things that, like, for you and I that play Forza a lot, like, when you realize you're catching somebody, you start pushing the boundaries just a little bit more. You try to get on the throttle a little bit sooner. And I think what he did is he got on the throttle a little too soon, at which point he then got offline into 1. The rear steps out when he was trying to make it for the race line. And then he goes up over the apex. The rear hits the tire barriers, and obviously tire barriers being more old school technology, which I love. Fantastic. It absorbed the energy and rebounded it, and the car flipped. Fortunately, he was fine, and it looked a lot worse than it was. Right. Because if you look at it in real time, the speed that he rolls is actually pretty slow. It's just that he rolls and the tires go flying.
Right. So they replayed it in slow motion a couple times, and it looks way worse in slow motion than it did in real time. I mean, like, not nearly as bad of a crash as Silverstone last year in F1.
Yeah, no, certainly.
That crash was way worse, and it's one of those things. I was actually sitting there and listening to it, and they were like, "Oh, the number 2 car is upside down, in turn 1," and I was like, "I didn't know you could roll an F1 car these days, or roll a race car these days." And then I was like, "Oh, we actually rolled the grippiest race cars you can last year, the most downforcing grip we rolled on last year." Thankfully, driver's okay, but that was some really early drama that most people did not see.
I mean, I had just brewed my cup of coffee in my GTP Racing Reborn mug, and I'm like, I'm sitting back on the couch, added my half and half to it, and I'm like sipping. I'm just like, holy shit! Like, where'd that come from?
Yeah, it's one of those things of your like, first couple laps, everyone's real bunched up. Yeah. Maybe someone gets spun, pushed into a wall. A lot of passing where you don't expect, like, oh, there's going to be a Ferrari flying through the air.
Speaking of Ferraris flying.
Oh, man, I was... Okay, I think we were both going for the same thing there.
The Ferraris... So, for those of y'all that weren't able to watch it, this is kind of how the hypercar field broke down. The Ferraris and the Toyotas were by far the fastest cars on track.
For sure.
Bar none. Like, those two were in a league of their own. However, the only caveat to the Ferrari's pace is that in the double stints, the Ferrari was worse over the long run on old tires than the Porsche or the Cadillac was. But in a single stint, or if, let's say, they're on the same strategy, the Ferrari was quicker. So you had the Ferrari and the Toyotas, and then behind them, but close, you had the Porsche and the Cadillac, and they were faster than the Van Wall, the Glickenhaus, and the Peugeot. Let's see. So Ferrari, God, it's just part of their DNA, made a pit stop, bungled the pit stop. AF Corsa screwed up the pit stop on one of the 499Ps. AF Corsa also fields GTE cars. So they brought in GTE cars. And if the 499P pit stop went correctly, there wouldn't have been a further problem. The 499 pit stop did not go correctly. And then they got boxed into their own pit box by another AF Corsa GTE car. And then in the course of trying to get out of the pit stop, was penalized for not doing the pit stop correctly, at which point I just sat back and started laughing because I was like, Ferrari, as long as Ferraris are red, there will always be pit stop or strategy issues. All the dogs just came in, and they are loud.
Hi, dogs.
So they got penalties. Porsche was off the pace for most of the day, and I told my brother, I am so used to Porsches when it counts. Like, not all the time being faster, but, like, when it counts, when you get the hot shoe behind the wheel, always, like, never missing a beat, always able to close down, lurking, like Jaws in the background, closing in on who's ahead. And Porsche just was slow until our Lord and Savior, the only Frenchman I like, Kevin Estre, got into the car. And Kevin Estre, when he's in GT3 RSRs, when he's in GT3Rs, when he's in a GT3 RS doing hot laps around the Nordschleife, If you put Kevin Estre and put him in any car, he will always be faster than anyone else in the same car. Kevin Estre closed on the Ferrari. The Porsche had a 20 lap, at the time that they were battling, was out for 20 laps, and the Ferrari was out for 21 laps. So very equal tires, very equal fuel load. Kevin Estre closed down on the Ferrari and overtook him for third place. And I was shouting, I was like, go Kevin, go Kevin, go Kevin. I was like, please. So that was great. That was the one moment of the entire race where Porsche and Ferrari were actually battling. And it was awesome. Like, I'm so excited for Portimao to see, because if you notice in that turn 17 camera, the Porsches, not as a defense for them being slow, I just think they had the wrong setup.
Right.
The cars were bouncing the most in turn 17 to the point where they were having oversteer. I don't think that they had the right setup. So hopefully on a smoother track, Porsche can squeeze more performance out of it.
Right. And that is something that we need to remember is that, well, yes, this is the first race of the season. We did get to see LMH and GTP cars battling for the first time. Something to remember is that, like we said, Sebring is a very weird track. It is the slowest track on the WEC calendar. So Portimao should, without a doubt, have a different result. I don't know if you'll see Toyota at the back of the grid, but
no, certainly not.
I mean, the Ferrari looks fast. Something that I was surprised about, actually, was the Cadillac being ahead of the Porsches. I expected...
Well, and that only came later in the day, too, because the Porsches were definitely faster for maybe the first half of the race.
Right.
And then the Cadillac started reeling that back in. And we, ladies and gentlemen, are going to address the Porsche and the Cadillac when we also get to our little preview of the 12-hour tomorrow. Because I think we're going to see a Porsche Cadillac battle for the win tomorrow, but we'll see how that
be
goes.
Determined.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a bit.
So, but it's something to remember is that if you are not an endurance racing fan, which for starters, why not?
You literally get the most racing. Also, I realized, let's do Sebring next year because you get, within 2 days, 20 hours of top-class endurance racing. And I was like,
you got to buy tickets for 2 races.
Either way, you get, but you don't have to separate 2 weekends. You don't have to be in 2 different places at this.
One hotel room.
Exactly. One drive back.
Right. So, something to remember is that LMH cars, so the 499P, the GR010, the non-IMSA
hypercar classes
are allowed to be all-wheel drive. So
that's true.
So the Toyota, the Ferrari, and the Peugeot
are all-wheel?
Are all-wheel drive.
Wow. That makes that more impressive than that the Cadillacs and Porsches were.
The Toyota and the Peugeot are a mechanical all-wheel drive. So they are the motor, the internal combustion engine powers the rear wheels and the front wheels.
Right.
The Ferrari is a E all-wheel drive. So it's
ICE for the rear and battery
internal
for the
combustion rear hybrid motor or electric motor front.
That's probably the way to do it.
I think that's the way to do it because I think it makes for a lighter car, even though they have the same minimum weight. But I think as far as packaging goes, that makes for a lighter car and allows you to move stuff around better.
Well, more than that, I would think it lessens the wear on the front wheels if you're not pushing quite as much power to the front wheels as you are the rear. So it would drive in between a true all-wheel drive and a rear-wheel drive car.
Right.
Speaking of the Peugeots... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And so that was something I was surprised about, is knowing that Sebring is the slowest track. So I wasn't super surprised to see the Toyotas and the Ferraris being very fast, because an all-wheel drive car would do better at a slower track. Whereas when I think we get to the faster tracks, I think that the all-wheel drive... Like Le Mans and every other track, I think that all-wheel drive is going to be less of an advantage. I still think it will be an advantage for things like the bus stops at Le Mans. I think those are going to be huge there, but I don't think it'll be as big of an advantage when we get there. But, Nick, speaking of the Peugeots.
Yeah, so... Oh, God. Okay, so there's 2 parts of this race coverage that I am going to just lay into some people. Starting with the French.
What the French did to you?
Alpine? Come on.
Fair.
I mean, come on. They gave Alonso the most DNFs in a season, so Peugeot. For those of y'all that don't remember, hypercar as a class is in its third year, I believe, for WEC.
Yep. Correct.
Toyota has been there all of those years.
Peugeot
came in the second half of last season. Yep. Like, they ran, I think, 2 or 3 races last season. Yep. And the purpose of that, if you remember, and we actually may have talked about this on very early episodes of this here podcast.
I think we did.
Was to gain an advantage and experience and knowledge about their car so that when Porsche, Cadillac, and obviously at the time they didn't know Acura wasn't going to run in WEC,
right.
Whenever those cars came, they would at least have reliability and organizational advantages over the new teams and the new cars. Yep. With that being said, the fact Peugeot could not, for more than 2 hours consecutively, have their cars functioning on track, I'm not just saying this because I have predisposed grievances against the French.
Mm-hmm.
It is shameful. Like, you're putting forward a racing team. You've won Le Mans. You've won Sebring when you were last competing in LMP1. You've had race advantages over Porsche and Cadillac, who at Daytona, the last race, were having mechanical issues on an easier track. And you as Peugeot, and guys, we're not even talking about super high-tech aerodynamic components. We're talking about gearboxes.
Right.
Like, what in your gearbox is so technologically new or evolutionary that,
right.
Oh, well, we couldn't have known how it was going to handle around Sebring, or, oh, we don't have a full grasp on that. No, like, Peugeot was embarrassing this race. Like, utterly
it was pretty
embarrassing. I'm going to move past that Ferrari bullet point. I'll come back to it. Okay. Van Wall, and Ben will remember this commentary, Van Wall, of all the new teams, had arguably the most impressive debut.
Correct.
Because unlike Porsche and Cadillac, who have at least one race under their belt, albeit not WEC, Van Wall has had no races under their belt. So if you compare the Van Wall to how Porsche did at Daytona, or how BMW or Acura did at Daytona, even the Acura's had some issues, this was a very impressive debut. And the only thing that broke...
All the cars had issues at Daytona.
The only thing that broke was the left rear suspension, which... Okay, just build it stronger. But they didn't have a drivetrain issue. They didn't have aerodynamic issues. Granted, they were slower, but they finished ahead of the Peugeots, which, again, going back to my point I just made, Peugeot having the advantage and having raced their car ever is an advantage over the Van Wall. And the Van Wall, in the one category where new teams have the most trouble, which is reliability, had almost no issues. Jacques Villeneuve did great. It was so cool seeing his original 96, 97 helmet that he was wearing.
That was pretty cool. I really liked that.
He got out of the car. He was super happy. And I think in terms of the overall look, granted, I know I'm biased, I think Ferrari is number one in terms of the look of the car, with Porsche like right behind it. It's purely because of the angled rear end plates on the Ferrari. It looks so sick.
It's so good.
So it's Ferrari, Porsche, and then I think Van Wall is right there with the look of the car.
I would agree with you. And the other thing to remember about the thing to know about the Van Wall is, of the hypercars, it is the most simple. It is running
I was going to say that, yeah.
So it's running a Gibson V8. If you've never heard of Gibson, they make the 4.2-liter V8 that is in all the LMP2 cars. So the Van Wall is essentially a spiced-up LMP2 car. So that's why it is so reliable, is they took proven technology that's been around for like 10 years and then just stuck it and threw the hypercar rulebook at it. So that is why that car had such little reliability issues. Did they expect to be, winning this race? No, I don't think so. I think the fact that they finished and didn't have any reliability issues.
I don't think they expect to win any race this year. I think their goal is to just improve.
Right. Is as a new team, this new, I think that, finish is their goal. Go
ahead.
I think that running that Gibson engine and getting someone as experienced as Jacques Villeneuve is an outstanding move. I think that Van Wall, hopefully we have them for years to come, and it becomes a name that, people our age, well, my age, not your age, you're like 30 years older.
Right,
than me,
no, I
but-
was around when they made their debut, yeah.
Right, you were there at the first Van Wall race.
Yeah.
But I hope that people my age and younger can get familiar with the Van Wall name, and it becomes, one of those teams that people remember for a while.
So the most, not dramatic, but the biggest accident that had overall race implications was the accident of the number 51 Ferrari 499P that made contact with the GTE Ferrari that was the number 54. As a result, the number 51 car was down 7 laps, which basically put them out of contention for the race. Granted, they were still ahead of Van Wall, the 2 Peugeots, and the Glickenhaus. But it was an unfortunate racing incident because the Ferrari is making an outside maneuver going into 15 and 16. Actually 14, in between 14 and 15, before the braking zone of 16, out wide, off the race limits, out in the marbles. And the GTE Ferrari, because WEC has the back straight as their pit lane between 16 and 17, the GTE Ferrari was
only for this race because IMSA's using
the front straight.
The front straight.
So the Ferrari GTE car was trying to come across from track left to track right to enter pit lane. And the Ferrari, if you look, was so far behind the car that by the time the Ferrari driver kind of makes that apex and he goes to turn, if he had checked his mirror prior to that little kink, he wouldn't have seen the Ferrari.
Right.
And then made contact. So the Ferrari, it was honestly light contact, but what it did was push the Ferrari onto the marbles. The Ferrari didn't really have a lockup, but he lost complete control.
Right.
The car turned backwards, and the left rear tire clobbered the AO Racing GT3 RSR, which was a shame because the AO Racing GT3 RSR was doing well, one of the best looking cars on the grid.
Right, and that is the number 56 car, and so number 51 car hit the 54, which spun into the 56.
Yes, a lot of 50s.
A lot of 50s, and the thing to remember about that is that the 51 car, the 499P, received a 10-second time penalty.
Yes,
not for hitting the 54, but for hitting the 56.
Which is a stupid penalty because he was literally sliding backwards out of control.
Right. There's literally nothing he could have done for that, and it's one of those things of like...
And it was a result of earlier contact, too. I mean...
Right. I mean, it was one of those things of it's like, if anything, that should have been penalized for, messing up the 54, but it was not the 56, so... it's like the one controversial thing that happened this race.
Not the Peugeots. Sorry, so many cars broke down when they've had experience running in WEC.
A lot of cars broke.
But this car is even more shameful, the Glickenhaus.
Oh my gosh.
So Glickenhaus with a one-car effort this year in this race. Obviously, they're going to be running 2 at Le Mans. Mechanical failure, cars out. The reason I'm more upset over the Glickenhaus isn't because I like them. It's because Jim, is his last name Glickenhaus?
Glickenhaus.
Yeah, Jim Glickenhaus is one arrogant SOB. Like, he has said he wants to be the next Carroll Shelby, which, newsflash, Carroll Shelby won races. I don't know if you're aware. Also, Carroll Shelby himself was a driver. Don't know if you're aware.
And the other thing is that...
just because you're American and you wear something that mildly resembles a cowboy hat and you go racing does not mean you're Carroll Shelby.
Well, the other thing to remember is that Jim, technically his name is James Glickenhaus, actually made his money in the film industry and producing and screenwriting and became very wealthy. Some of it's family money, some of it's from his work in the film industry, and just owns a bunch of cool stuff.
Which is fine.
Like a 412P and a Lola T70 and Dino Berlinetta and, a ton of other cool stuff. So he's just one of those things of it's like, rich dude decided to start his own car company. It's one of those things of like, there's a bunch of concepts and we've seen a bunch of pictures of cars running, so he's starting a hypercar program. And
here's the thing is Glickenhaus has been running for 3 years as well.
Yeah.
And so... Glickenhaus has, other than financial backing, every advantage that Toyota theoretically should have. The time in the series, the organizational experience, the development of the car, and somehow, they figure out a way to finish last. They shouldn't even be finishing behind Peugeot. Because if you're just going to look at experience and organizational competence, And at no point does Glickenhaus ever say to himself, maybe I'm not cut out for this. Or maybe we need to fundamentally look for a different design of the car. Or maybe I need to hire some new engineers because we're just not competitive. Ever.
Well, I mean, it's so Glickenhaus actually...
Again, more kudos to Van Wall. Van Wall's coming in here with none of the advantages that Peugeot or Glickenhaus have, and they beat both of them.
Right. So, the predecessor to the SCG 007, which is what this car is the 003, which I remember, but I don't remember when it was. Actually, so the 003 CS, which is the race car version, was actually built in 2014, and you can actually still buy one today. And that car raced in the 24 Hours of Nürburgring several times. So it's not like Glickenhaus is as fresh as Van Wall. They've been doing this much longer than them. They have probably almost certainly more money than Van Wall. So the Glickenhaus is, I don't expect them to be battling the Toyotas
it's a shame
and the
too,
Ferraris,
because it
but
looks so old school.
It looks cool, yeah.
I just can't get it to be
I like the blue livery. It looks cool. Yeah, Jim Glickenhaus is a bit nuts, but if you were 75 years old and a billionaire, you would be too.
I would build a winning car. So Toyota ran 1-2 basically the entire race, and they had a 1-lap advantage over third place. And this just further reinforces the point I've made to death so far, that the experienced team, regardless of how fast the car is a overpowering advantage, because Ferrari had a faster car, but Ferrari and AF Corsa, new to the hypercar program, the hypercar level of competition, did not have what it takes to stay on par with Toyota over the 8 hours. So the hypercar finish was the number 7 Toyota GR car first, the number 8 Toyota GR car second, and third is the AF Corsa Ferrari number 50, and that was closely followed by the Cadillac. Unfortunately, pretty boring finish for hypercar. The closest cars on track were the Cadillac and the Ferrari. Moving to LMP2. For most of the race, it was Prema versus Jota versus United Autosports versus Inter Europol. There was plenty of 3- and 4-way battles for the lead. LMP2 was actually, other than the beginning for GTE, the best racing in the entire
LMP2 was
field.
actually really interesting. It is a class that I want to follow more. I think it doesn't get enough love.
Unfortunately, it's because the cars are spec. Like, if they look different and
the cars are spec, they're all the same. They're all made by Orica. It's one of those things of, I think the racing is really cool. I think the cars look really cool. After seeing an LMP car for the first time last weekend, I think they are the coolest things on the planet. So it is something I want to follow a bit closer.
So this class came right down to the end in terms of the finish with 4 minutes left. The number 63 Prema car was leading the race, and they were forced to pit for fuel, losing them the race win. So first was the Hertz Team Jota number 48 car. The second was the number 22 United Autosport car. And falling down to third was the Prema number 63 car, moving to GTE. From the get-go, it was a Corvette Porsche battle. We had the pink Iron Dames car, which had a freaky turn 1 off, where they didn't hit the wall, didn't make contact with another car, but and it reminds me of the Joey Hand crash in ALMS when he was in a BMW at Mid-Ohio, where he ran off in the grass and the car just in the middle of, like, looks normal,
just
takes off.
Hops in the air.
The GT3 RSR, the front didn't go up much, but it went over a bump, and then the rear caught the bump and launched the rear of the car up to where you could almost see the entire top of the car.
And rip the diffuser out from under the car.
And when it lands, it rips not only just the diffuser, but the entire floor from the driver back, because it has a section of the floor and then a gap where the engine hangs out, and then the diffuser. All of it ripped off the back, including the entire rear bumper. It could have literally ripped the gearbox out of the car.
It could have been much worse.
Well, the commentators were like, it looks like Moby Dick, the 935, because it had all the open rear engine, everything. They're like, that's how the RSR should look.
We should do
which,
that more.
Unfortunately, that Iron Dames car was probably the favorite for the win because it looked
it was really
faster
fast
and more consistently fast than the Corvette.
And they were on pole, and they were going really strong.
So that one mistake cost them the race.
Sebring is an unforgiving track.
Yeah, so it became a Corvette-Porsche battle, but it was a Porsche of the Dempsey Proton car, the number 77. However, I say battle. It was really the Corvette, and it was the Corvette a lap ahead of that car. We already mentioned the AO Racing GT3 car that was tagged in the 499P off. We had 2 Aston Martin right side punctures, not caused by contact.
Not a good weekend for Aston.
Yeah, and it was weird. I'm not saying they had anything to do with each other, but they were similar in the sense that there was no contact. They didn't go off or rub anything. It just punctures randomly. They're both on the right side. And then the second place Ferrari made a last-minute pit stop, like literally with less than 3 minutes left in the race.
It was very late.
A lap or two. Cost them second place. So it was a first place for the Corvette number 33 car. It was a second place for the Dempsey Proton Racing number 77 GT3 RSR. And a third place for the Kessel Racing number 57 Ferrari. And that was the Ferrari that made the last-minute stop. Ben, I've talked a lot. Yes.
Is that Dempsey as in Patrick Dempsey?
Yes.
Is that Dempsey?
Yeah, so that was the team he was running when he was racing, and he was running in ALMS and IMSA. And then once he retired, he's still running the team. But Ben?
Yes.
Overall, I know you didn't get to watch a lot. You got to watch, the last 40 minutes, the last hour?
I got to watch about the last hour, yeah.
So what were your overall thoughts of this year's WEC field? Because you watched more of it last year than I did.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think WEC is a season that all racing fans should follow. I understand that F1 kind of has its fans of, like, I'm an F1 fan, it's really all that I follow.
Yep.
Motorcycle fans rarely cross over. I am one of the freaks that does. But I think more people should follow WEC. I know that a lot of people don't want to sit here for 8 hours and watch it. But I mean, I was at work. I had my earbuds in. It was going on in the background. So you don't have to watch it. You don't have to be Nick and sit there with your dogs and your cup of coffee.
I'm not kidding. When I went to Target to grab the Lego set, I ordered it online for pickup. And we went to pick it up, and I was changing Sam's music in his phone on one hand, and I was streaming it live on my phone. We walked into Target, and she was like, here's your Lego set, and I reached out and I grabbed it, still watching the race. Sam was like, wait, there's a car coming. I'm like, what?
You're like, I know, turn 2, there's a car
coming. Like, I know it's the Porsche.
No, WC is all... There's always... I've never watched an endurance race that doesn't have good racing.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is there's always some factor that you get purely because of the endurance aspect of it, whether it's the track changing. With Daytona, Porsche wasn't competitive when the sun was up. When the sun went down, Porsche got competitive. When the sun came back up, Porsche wasn't so competitive.
Well, and the other thing is that because they run multiple classes at the same time, that makes it
the traffic
so much more interesting, because there was a point in time where the number 1 and number 2 LMP2 cars were super close, and a 963, I think it was the number 5 car.
Yes, came out on cold tires.
Came out on cold tires, was super slow.
That was scary. I was like, please don't rear end it.
So the commentators said that a hypercar on cold tires is slower
than a slow GT3 car.
Than a slow GTE car. So that shows you the pace of those cars. That shows you how much cold tires are a factor in this racing. So there were 2 LMP2 cars on warm tires getting caught up by a hypercar. So there's just always something happening.
Yep.
It's not only is it, so yeah, the GTE race was, the leader was a lap ahead. Okay, so that wasn't super interesting. But, they get caught up in traffic. There's LMP2 cars battling. There's hypercars. There's Ferraris going in the pit lane that don't check their mirrors. There's always stuff happening. So WC is a season that you should watch. It's always super interesting. But similar to WEC is IMSA, which if you
missed the 1,000 miles.
Don't worry, we have 12 hours of it tomorrow. We have like 1,200 miles of Sebring tomorrow. So we have the IMSA 12 hours. This is something that has always thrown me off, in that they race the same weekend, but it's not the same race, and it's not raced over the same distance.
Cars, but it's different teams. Yeah,
right. But these run GT3, not GTE, and it's a whole thing. So tomorrow we have the 12 hours of Sebring, which should be super exciting, that is GTP only. So there will be no Toyotas, no Glickenhaus, no Vanwall, no Peugeot, no Ferraris.
Get it out of here.
So none of those. We will be Acura, Cadillac, Porsche,
BMW.
BMW.
Yep, that's it.
That's it? That's it? Okay. There's too much racing happening. So, smaller hypercar field, it's technically GTP field because it's IMSA. So, smaller GTP field, but nevertheless, just as interesting racing. It's over 12 hours, which we won't get that much night racing, correct? Because it starts in the morning. And
Does
then
it start in the morning?
I think it does, right? We determined it starts at like 7 a.m.?
I know
like
it goes
8 a.m.?
well into the dark because if you remember that clip of the 997 Flying Lizard car and the Corvette that came out of the last... Or the Ferrari. It was the Ferrari. It starts 10 a.m. Is that Eastern?
Is that 10 a.m.?
Hold on. This one has the time zone.
Regardless, it's 12 hours and it starts when the sun is up, so it's going to end in the night. That's just how Earth works. So that should be super interesting.
It starts at 10 a.m. Eastern, so 9 a.m. Central.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so it's going to run well into the night.
Yeah.
So, but we do have qualifying results because that did happen yesterday. Yesterday, we did have qualifying, and it looks like the Cadillacs are strong. So something we talked about was the Cadillacs and the Porsches looked pretty even during the 8 hours. So is that Cadillac and those two Porsches, are they racing IMSA? Or no?
This is, well, okay, so
this
yes
is that
and no.
blurry section.
Yes and no. So before I answer that, when we were mentioning earlier in our race highlights of the WEC, I mentioned how we were going to come back to the Cadillacs and Porsches. The key thing here is, regardless of the cars, the same two teams are running that ran today tomorrow. So Penske and Chip Ganassi have 8 hours of race pace, race reliability, fuel strategy, tire strategy experience that Acura and BMW do not have. Nor does the Action Express Cadillac have. So I think that's a huge advantage. Obviously, I think a lot of people would agree. So more specifically to answer your question, the Porsches are not running those identical cars. So Porsche actually brought 5 cars to Sebring this weekend. 3 were going to run in the 1,000 miles. One of those was totaled. Or no. Okay, never mind. They brought 4 cars. They were going to run. Blurry. So yeah, if I've read this correctly, they brought 4. Mm-hmm. What will happen is 2 ran in the 1,000 mile, 2 will run tomorrow.
Okay.
What happened was there was an accident last night in one of the IMSA cars. Mm-hmm. That car was supposed to also run in WEC, but because of the accident, they couldn't get it fixed in time for today. So I believe it's running tomorrow in IMSA. If I'm wrong, the car's just totaled, period.
Okay. Interesting.
If I've read that correctly.
I'm not an engineer. I claim to be one, but I'm not. But I don't think you can fix carbon tubs overnight.
Well, that's why I'm saying I don't know if it was a totaled car or if it was that it was damaged too badly to be fixed overnight.
Oh, okay, but it might have been fixed all day. Okay,
correct. Let me. So anyway, that being said, the Cadillac is running that exact car. So you'll notice if you watched, for the other people that watched, it was the blue Cadillac from Chip Ganassi Racing. Right. That car is the same blue car that we see in IMSA to fill out the red, yellow, and blue trio from Chip Ganassi Racing. So yes, that car will be running tomorrow.
We are getting the red and the yellow car tomorrow, correct?
Yes.
We're getting all 3.
And we're getting the Whelen car, so 4.
Oh, we're going to have all 4.
Right? Isn't it?
No, the Whelen car is the red car.
No, it's not. At Daytona, no.
Yes. No. That's what I thought. Do I not have this right?
I'm going to look it up. I might be wrong.
Anyway, we're going to have a bunch of GTP cars there tomorrow. So the thing that should be interesting is how fast are the Acuras after their little incident from Daytona. Oh my god, I freaking knew it.
You always know more about American V8s, whatever.
In DPI, the Whelen Engineering car was the red one, so I just assumed that carried over. So that was my assumption. So should be interesting to see how the Acuras are. Also, what I'm actually most interested in for tomorrow's race is how will the BMWs do. I'm interested to see if they've fixed some of the reliability issues. I'm assuming they've done more testing, so I'm interested to see if that car can keep up at all. I'm interested to see if there's any reliability issues with the cars. 12 hours is significantly longer than 8 hours, so that should be interesting to see. But we do have a Cadillac 1-2 for tomorrow.
So I looked it up. Porsche brought 4 cars, 2 for WEC, 2 for IMSA.
Okay.
The confusing part is in WEC, it was the number 5 and the number 6. In IMSA, it's the number 6 and the number 7. So there's 2 number 6 963s, 1 for WEC, 1 for IMSA.
Oh,
so,
okay.
And it was an IMSA car that was wrecked Friday.
Got it.
So that will be running...
So there's only 2 Cadillacs running tomorrow.
Really?
Well, I'm looking at the IMSA website right now, and positions 1 through 8 in qualifying, there's 1 Cadillac, 2 Cadillac, that's it. So unless they're hidden
on
somewhere...
the front row then, huh?
So they're hidden somewhere way... Yeah, no, that's it. We've got 2 Cadillacs for tomorrow.
I was totally wrong. I don't know why I thought the blue one was running tomorrow as well.
So the number 31 car, Cadillac V LMDH, is on P1. P2 is the number 1 car, which is the car that we saw today. And then the Wayne Taylor Racing Acura is P3, followed by the number 6 Porsche 963, followed by the number 60 ever-famous now Meyershank Racing. Nick needs to calm down. Followed by the number 24 BMW, which qualified in front of the number 7 Porsche 963.
Because it wrecked. It's an exemption.
It's trash. And then in 8th place is the number 25 BMW, so that should be interesting to see. Nick, do you want to talk us through GT racing for tomorrow, which is GT3, not GTE, because for some reason it is.
So on pole, we have the number 3 Corvette of Antonio Garcia, Jordan Taylor, and Tommy Milner. It doesn't really matter where the rest of the GT drivers are. The most important part, not really the most important, but the most topical, something we've talked about a lot, is the IMSA BOP controversy. In that
controversy,
IMSA coming into this weekend, we've covered it in 2 separate episodes, said we're going to make some changes so that the Porsches are more competitive in the GT3 field based off Daytona.
Right.
The fastest Porsche, the first one, was 7th and 3/4 of a second off of the pole-sitting Corvette. Now, 3/4 of a second is not as big as it was.
Hey, yo, shout out to the Corvette, though. Qualified in front of an LMP3 car.
I know.
Attaboy.
3/4 of a second is a smaller gap than it was, but 3/4 of a second over a lap is still a large chunk of time.
Yeah, I
For
mean...
the fastest one, we're not even talking, from 1st to 7th, there was a 3/4 second gap, but it was pretty evenly mixed in terms of the cars.
So your top qualifying Porsche qualified 34th on the grid.
Overall,
34th on the grid. And then your next Porsche qualified 45th on the grid. And then, so we're 45th, 47th, 48th, 50th, 51st. Yeah. So, I mean...
I don't think they fixed it.
Here's the thing. 3/4 of a second, better. It's a slower track. Daytona is a very high-speed track.
However,
so
here's the unfortunate thing. Is 3/4 of a second is not something that with a different driver or, slightly fresher tires, you can make up. 3/4 of a second is a big enough chunk that it's fundamentally down to the BOP.
Right.
Where
now, I mean,
unless you put Kevin Estra in it, and then he'll just go lights out.
So, listeners, yes, you will be saying, but you just said that there was a hypercar that was 4.5 seconds down. Hypercar is going to be much more diverse than GT.
Well,
GT is supposed to be really bunched up in
the commentators were even saying hypercar does not have BOP as we know it. GT3 has BOP that is. So what they were saying is the hypercars have BOP in the sense that with aerodynamics, power, battery charge.
Right.
There are windows that kind
they
of
were given a
self-balance.
box. You have to build within this box, and that
And
should
different
figure
cars
itself
have
out.
strengths in a certain box versus another box.
Right.
In GT3, it is not at all like that.
Right.
So you have more reliance on the artificial BOP handed down by the race stewards to balance out the field than otherwise. And one of the other things is let's say in hypercar, Toyota was 4 seconds faster than Van Wall. What do you do to the Toyota to make it 4 seconds slower? Or what do you do to the Van Wall to make it 4 seconds faster? And obviously WEC with the hypercars views it as more helpful to just have the teams naturally develop these cars and grow with these cars, where in the long run it'll be more competitive compared to having, like IMSA after one race was like, we need to dramatically change
fix
BOP.
this. Right.
WEC's perspective is like, we got a long season ahead of us. The tracks are very different. Like Peugeot, their car is ground effects. You can't have ground effects when you have bumps like you do around Sebring. It just doesn't work. But they were saying around Portimao, with how smooth that surface is and how high speed it is, the Peugeot could be a lot more competitive. Right. Nothing on the cars having been changed, purely just a track difference. So a lot of BOP questions still concerned with IMSA. Ben, do you want to cover the Newcastle 500?
I will talk about Australian Supercar real quick. So Australian Supercar is something you've heard Nick and I both say we're super excited about. However, it's kind of hard to watch in this country. Crazy to think that Australian Supercar is hard to watch in America. Weird.
Yeah, you would have never guessed.
So, but we did have the first two races of the Gen 3 Supercar era, and it was exactly as exciting as we wanted it to be. So I watched the first race before episode 42, but I didn't get a chance to watch race 2, so I watched that this week. And I'm not going to go into super huge detail because it is the first race. So
and also there's a Mustang and a Camaro, and they all run V8s. So
so we can't read too much into it. Quick details. So, two cars. There is a S550 Mustang, which is the current gen, not the one coming out next year or whatever. It's an S550, not an S650.
The one that runs the V8 supercars is an S650.
It is not.
It certainly is, Ben. You are incorrect on this one. I am
Is it? Am
positive.
I losing my mind?
I am positive.
No.
It's a 6th gen Camaro ZL1.
Gosh dang it, it is. Sorry. The test cars were S550s. So, it's an S650, but it's running a Gen 2 Coyote, and it is a 5.4 liter, not a 5 liter. And the 6th gen Camaros are not running an LT; they are running an LS, and it is not And it is not 6.2 liters like in Nick's car. It is 5.7 liters like it was in my car. So somewhere in there, balance of performance.
It is
works.
as close to my engine as it is to yours. Don't even.
It's actually probably closer to yours than it is to mine.
Okay, fine. I get it. Just because you spend a lot of money on your motor, you want to be able to say that it's not the same.
Yes, precisely. So, however, it did look like we had a rather. The Mustangs looked quick this past weekend. So Newcastle is a notoriously difficult track. So starting there is a pretty serious thing. People were worried about that, but we had some really good racing. For race 1, we had Cam Waters P1 in his Monster Energy Ford Mustang, followed by Chaz Mostert in his Mobil 1 Optus Ford Mustang, followed by Brody Kostecki in his Coca-Cola Camaro ZL1. It's one of my favorite liveries.
Yep.
Race 2, we had David Reynolds in his Pinwright Racing Ford Mustang GT, followed by Chaz Mostert, once again P2 both races in that Mobil 1 Racing Ford Mustang, and then James Golding in his Nolan Racing Camaro ZL1 for race 3, P3 race 2. Words got away from me there.
Yes, indeed.
Excuse me, but so far it looks like BOP works. It looks like the cars are pretty
Well, believe
even.
it or not, when you say this is how much horsepower you can make, and it has to be on NA 8 cylinders,
people can do that.
the racing's pretty good.
So, actually, the cars. This is actually interesting. Is I watched a video that was way too long.
Probably.
On the motors, it was like 55 minutes. How
is there that much to talk about?
On the different motors. They're complicated, Nick. They do actually make different horsepower, but the LS makes more torque and doesn't rev as high, but the Mustang motor revs, so it's like
It's like it is in real life.
It's whoa. But it's one of those things of don't assume that the cars make the same amount of power. They're a bit different, and the motor's way different, so they took that into account as well. So it turns out the Australians have figured out BOP, and it works. So
Indeed.
we're going to make sure to follow Australian Supercar pretty closely this year because it looks like the racing is going to be pretty good. The last thing we're going to touch on
is F1, and Ben, I want you to cover it because I know how painful it is for you.
So, this weekend we have the Saudi Arabian
let me look at those
Grand
top
Prix.
fives. Oh, where the hell are the Ferraris?
I said, P3 in Sebring, baby. P3 in
You know
Sebring.
what? You can keep it. I'll take an Alonso P3 at Saudi Arabia.
You know, I had this thought this weekend. What would Nick be more upset by, a Porsche failure or a Fernando failure?
Definitely a Fernando failure, but I also have the fact that there's the 12 hours tomorrow, so I could get a Porsche win and a Fernando
podium. So
podium.
you could fail 3 times this weekend, whereas I'm only going to fail twice. So,
well, yeah, from here on out.
Right. So, Saudi Arabian GP, all we've had is free practice, so we're not going to read into it too much, but Nick's going to read into it
That's
too
what
much.
we say every time. We do have
Nick,
a Fernando podium last weekend to read into.
Nick, get off, you know.
Aston Martin is second in the constructors. Just gonna
get off your high horse. Relax. So, for starters, the big news is
My
that
Spanish stallion? I don't think so.
Ferrari is absolute garbage. And despite
Ferrari
the fact that
put all their budget cap into the 499p.
Okay, so that was the thing. Is everyone's like, "Oh, the hypercar is so that they can, keep staff or
it was
whatever."
backwards.
No. It's actually they were just like, you know what? This Formula One thing ain't
In
working.
2022,
guys.
when Ferrari was like, no, we're putting the budget into next year's car, they meant the 499, not the...
right, not this car, but next year's car for a different
car
series.
for WEC.
So Leclerc is receiving a 10-place grid penalty, and I think...
And he's already out of... I don't remember what part of the engine it was, but he's already out for the entire season. He's used up his allotment, somehow.
So here's the thing, is you were allowed 2 of every major component, and this is the... People just keep saying, oh, they're replacing the engine. It's not the engine, it's the control unit for the drivetrain.
But it's his third.
It's his third one. We haven't had the second race yet. Why? Anyway... I'm fine.
How did he use 2 in one race?
I don't know how this.
He only caught on fire once.
Oh my gosh. So Leclerc's receiving a 10-place grid penalty, but Carlos Sainz, they replaced his as well for the weekend.
You know what's so great is you're wearing that hat.
Precautionary measures.
You can somehow have so much pride with third at Sebring, and yet so much shame in Saudi Arabia,
hey, man,
in the same crest.
It's been 50 years.
How do they fit it into that little shield? How do you fit so much?
It's been 50 years since the top class of sports car racing.
It's been basically 50 years since Ferrari had a world championship in Formula One.
Basically, so it's we got to be excited about something. It's all Ferrari's going to have no Formula One fans anymore. We're all jumping ship to WEC.
Kids that were born when Ferrari last had their World Drivers' Championship who are now eligible to drive. There are kids that were born and now drive since Ferrari's had a World Championship. How does that make you feel?
Sad. So, free practice 1. Surprise, Max Verstappen was fastest. No one's surprised about that. For starters, he was sick, apparently. He got better. Cool.
Yeah, I saw a bunch of memes, and it was like Ricardo continually trying to poison Verstappen's food.
Right. So, Max Verstappen, P1. In FP1, Sergio Perez, P2. Nearly half a second behind him, of course. Fernando Alonso, P3. Lance Stroll, P4. Well done, Lance.
Aston Martin second in the constructors. Here we go.
And then George Russell, P5. Free practice 2, Max Verstappen once again was up there. Alonso this time ran faster than Perez, running P2. Perez was P3. Esteban Ocon, P4. Don't know where that came from. Ocon, P4. And then George Russell, once again, Mr. Consistency, P5. Now, this is personally one of my favorite street circuits. I know Nick isn't a fan of it. Judging by the face that he just made.
Let me go back. You keep talking. I'm going to go to our prediction sheet, and I'm almost positive this was the track that I would want to lose off the calendar the most.
I'm almost positive I put this as my favorite street circuit. Almost positive. I like it for the same reason I like Sebring. Something is bound to go wrong. It's not because the track is good, but because the chaos is immense.
My lose was Saudi Arabia.
Let me see. I know I've got mine in here. Ben, prediction podcast. Let me scroll. Still scrolling. Keep scrolling. Load, please. Oh no, I put Baku as my best street race.
Oh, yeah, I think Baku's better than
All right.
Saudi Arabia. You're so wrong. You're just wrong about everything.
Thought I was crazy for a second. Thought I was losing it.
Almost lost my cool there.
So, but they did change some of the circuit. The wall that Verstappen famously hit last year.
Yeah. Did they move it?
They moved it. How convenient
Unfair.
for him. So apparently, street circuits where the danger is hitting walls. Apparently, how you fix that is move the walls. Don't be better. Just make it easier.
They're like, we want it to be a street circuit, but people hit the walls. We don't know why.
But it's dangerous. So, I mean, it should be a good race. If you don't hear from me, or from us Monday, it's because Alonso had another podium. And I have either murdered Nick, or have just gone into hiding. And I'm just, crying
and you will get the
pictures
most
of the
poorly
499p.
edited podcast
You will
with me
get a
as your
horribly
host.
edited podcast. It's just Nick. So it's going to be like, you ever seen like the video of old people on FaceTime where it's like right in front of their face? That's
I
just
was going to
be
say
Nick.
it's just going to be perpetually my face photoshopped onto the Batman teabagging Robin meme, and you're Robin.
If you can edit that, that's fine.
You're like, you know what? Actually, new profile photo.
That'd be kind of funny. So that is going to do it for episode 43 of the Clutch Dump podcast. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. Whatever platform you're listening to this on, make sure you give us a follow. Please leave a rating and review. It helps us very much to grow and find a bigger audience. If you're watching this on YouTube, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you hit the like button, turn on the notification bell, and make sure to share this video. Thank you so much for being here. This has been episode 43 of the Clutch Dump. We'll see you next time.